Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this last session of what has been the most fantastic St Hilda's Crime Weekend. It's not entirely over when we finish because, of course, there will be the Whodunnit reveal, which I'm sure everyone is waiting for. But before we have that, we have a session. I'm very delighted to welcome Jane Casey and Carolyn Kirby. We're talking about Peter Wimsey and we're talking about the Gothic in Oxford. So Jane first. Jane Casey is an Irish crime writer. She read English at Jesus College, Oxford, and she worked in children's books before publishing her first book, The Missing, in 2010. She writes the award-winning Maeve Kerrigan series of police procedural novels and is a member of Killer Women, as indeed am I. Her most recent book is The Killing Kind, a standalone crime novel about a young barrister whose life is in danger. She's currently working on the 10th Maeve Kerrigan novel, but today she's here to talk to us about Lord Peter Wimsey's Oxford.
Hello. It is a huge honour for me to have the opportunity to take part in this wonderful weekend and to speak about one of my favourite authors, Dorothy L. Sayers, exploring how Oxford contributed to the creation and development of her immortal detective, Lord Peter Wimsey. It is an enormous subject. I could speak for 10 times as long and not cover every aspect of his character, even as it relates to Oxford. Wimsey's Oxford background is as integral to his persona as a skeleton is to a body. Without it, he might collapse altogether in a pile of witticisms. Oxford is one of my favourite places on earth, and the first time I visited it was in the pages of Gaudy Night. When I eventually reached it myself, I felt I knew every stone of it through Sayers' brilliant depiction of it. Incidentally, my first trip to Oxford involved staying in St Hilda's with my sister Philippa, a proud Hildebeest and fellow Gaudy Night fan. It couldn't have been more perfect for a crime fiction obsessed teenager. When I was preparing for this talk, my 9-year-old, a good but occasionally inattentive reader, asked me why I was reading so many books by Dorothy Sayers. It was an accidental anagram that I thought Sayers would have enjoyed, even though I think she might have pulled a face at the possible implication that her literary body count was high. Being remembered as one of the great writers of the golden age of crime fiction was not her dream. Writing crime fiction, at least at first, was a way for her to make money, much as working in advertising was a job rather than a vocation. Her reservations about crime fiction as a genre come through as a subtle theme in the early Wimsey stories and in great crashing chords in Gaudy Night, which I think is one of the most honest and self-lacerating works of crime fiction ever written, and all the better for it. As a writer of series fiction myself, I'm fascinated by the choices Sayers made in creating the character of Lord Peter Wimsey and how she chose to let his idiosyncrasies play out until Gaudy Night, when he arrives in Oxford, a place where eccentricities are more normal than normality, and where rather than standing out, he's perfectly at his ease. Gaudy Night is, of course, not the final book in the series, but the Wimsey that we meet in Gaudy Night is Wimsey in his final form, cool and cultured, tough and unflinching, an experienced lover who is patient and honourable enough to wait for Harriet Vane to respond to him as a man and a fellow intellect and an ally. He proves himself to be a suitable partner to her in every possible way, from the physical to the metaphysical. However, if he's capable of winning her over at that point, it's because he is at the end of a long journey that involved winning over his creator too. It's often said that Sayers fell in love with Wimsey. Leaning on my own experience of writing complicated and charismatic characters, I would suggest that her feelings are not quite as straightforward as all that. It's hard to be swept off your feet by a character who you ultimately control. Nor would I draw a direct line between real life and the character on the page, despite the fact that Balliol's poet chaplain Roy Ridley was reputedly at least a physical model for Wimsey. Real life is untidy, real people even more so, and they are difficult to frame in a fictional world in a way that makes them fit in. Instead, I would suggest that most writers create characters who represent something they want to be themselves or to possess in some way. The Wimsey we meet in the 1923 novel Whose Body is wealthy, independent, and sophisticated, with the sort of background that makes his actions unquestionable. Sayers wrote about how she designed Wimsey's flat with her ideal home in mind, while living in less salubrious surroundings. She gave him a passion for old books and music that she shared. He is Sayers, as she could have been, without the limitations of her sex and class, with total financial and social confidence. Wimsey is free to indulge himself however he wishes. For me, her envy of him bleeds through some uncomfortably equivocal writing about him. When he first appears, with a heartfelt, "Oh, damn," he is in the act of annoying a cab driver, asking him to perform an awkward maneuver with all of his aristocratic entitlement on display. Sayers famously describes how his long, amiable face looked as if it had generated spontaneously from his top hat, as white maggots breed from gorgonzola. That is not the description of an author in love with her character. That is a description written by a woman who has been waiting for years to get her revenge on the effortless privilege she has seen at close quarters. However, it's no fun to write books about someone you dislike, and Sayers is too good a writer to give us Bertie Wooster with a magnifying glass, or as Wimsey himself says on changing his clothes, "Exit the amateur of first editions, new motif introduced by solo bassoon, enter Sherlock Holmes, disguised as a walking gentleman." Presented with a large, unwieldy body reclining in a bathtub in the Battersea flat of his mother's architect, Wimsey throws himself into finding out what happened to him and how his appearance corresponds with the disappearance of one Sir Reuben Levy. Honestly, it's not a great novel. The mystery isn't particularly complex, and to a modern reader, there are some extraordinarily offensive lines about the Jewish characters and about class, but it is a work of its time. Wimsey himself spends money extravagantly, and in an uneasy scene compares it with the much smaller amount he pays his manservant, Bunter. But that imbalance of power is later corrected. Sayers gives us a tender picture of the traumatized Wimsey trapped in a hallucination, seeking reassurance from a paternal Bunter in the middle of the night, the two men bonded forever by their experience in the trenches. There's a self-destructive quality to Wimsey when we first meet him, an energy barely held in check by his interests and diversions. He has been through hell. He has looked death in the eye. That has earned him the right to deal with death candidly, but at a cost. It's rare in Golden Age crime fiction for the amateur detective to dwell on his or her role, but Wimsey questions his own motivation. It's a hobby to me, you see. I took it up when the bottom of things was rather knocked out for me because it was so damned exciting. And the worst of it is I enjoy it, up to a point. If it was all on paper, I'd enjoy every bit of it. I love the beginning of a job, when one doesn't know any of the people and it's just exciting and amusing. But if it comes to really running down a live person and getting him hanged, or even quadded, poor devil, they don't seem as if there was any excuse for me butting in, since I don't have to make my living by it. And I feel as if I oughtn't ever to find it amusing. But I do. As an introduction to Wimsey, Whose Body does a superb job of establishing the tent poles of his character, the aristocracy, the Great War, and Oxford. What appears in public is the Balliol-educated nobleman, and what disappears behind a thin veneer of civilization is the soldier who risked his life for his country. The skull beneath the skin shows through now and then, and more so in the later novels. Doing what's right is difficult, and yet it must not be shirked. So why choose Balliol for Wimsey? Balliol's reputation at the time was for academic brilliance in an offhand, annoyingly casual way. It was the most quintessentially Oxford of the Oxford colleges. In Gaudy Night, Wimsey describes the architecture as mathematically compounded of ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision, saying, "We are mortified in 19th century Gothic lest in our overweening Baliolity we forget God. Arrogance justified through brilliance, playful intellect, hundreds of years of lineage. I could be describing Wimsey himself as much as Balliol. Somerville, Sarah's own college, was, and indeed is, a 10-minute walk from Balliol, but it was another world. It was much less wealthy. It lacked centuries of tradition despite its importance. And like all of the women's colleges, it was a subject of some suspicion in the patriarchal university environment. The warden of Shrewsbury College in gaudy night brings up the question of women's education, saying, even in Oxford, we still encounter a certain number of people who maintain their right to disapprove. What Wimsey saw as a right was still a fight for women, no matter how clever they were. Women first entered the university in 1879 with the establishment of Lady Margaret Hall and Somerville, but it was 1920 before they could take university degrees, and indeed Sayers was in the first group to receive an MA. Her first-class degree, and Peter Wimsey's, would have been held to have a different value, as we see in Murder Must Advertise, first published in 1933. It draws directly on Sayers' own experience as a highly successful copywriter in an advertising agency. As most of her fans will know, she came up with the iconic Guinness Toucan and a host of other campaigns. Murder Must Advertise is a typically entertaining and vivid novel, giving a wry, behind-the-scenes look at the nature of advertising, but drawing in issues of class, education, ambition, the debauchery of the bright young things, and drug dealing. Sayers gives us an undercover Wimsey posing as his own impoverished but charming cousin, Death Breeden. She carves away everything that makes Wimsey himself, except his Balliol background. It's a way of establishing his credentials, of reassuring the other copywriters who have all, bar two, passed through Oxford or Cambridge. And here is Miss Meatyard, a Somerville alumna, cynically brilliant and able to solve the mysterious death of Victor Dean herself, but unable or unwilling to do anything about it. Who will listen to a woman? Only a lord can command the respect of the great Mr. Pym and force him to risk the reputation of the firm by admitting that a murder took place on the premises. Miss Meatyard would have been quietly removed from the payroll, as well she knew. It's clearly unthinkable for Wimsey to be anything other than a Balliol man, no matter that it risks blowing his cover. He is prepared to lose wealth, status, his address, his lifestyle, in fact, everything other than his intellectual reputation. The copywriters are divided between those who are the Oxford and Cambridge lot, for whom it's all give and take and bad language, and those who did not go to either of the great universities, who nurse great insecurity as a result. Then as now, Oxford and Cambridge alumni have a certain edge, carelessly wielded by those who studied there, feared by those who didn't. Incidentally, I think anyone who has read Murder Must Advertise has spent at least a few minutes trying to come up with a rhyme to finish off the limerick that begins, Breeden went to Balliol and sat at the feet of Gamaliel, and just as he ought, he cares for naught. But as Sayers points out, nothing else rhymes with Balliol. With the introduction of Harriet Vane in Strong Poison in 1930, the character of Wimsey entered a new phase. Not in Strong Poison itself, although in terms of plot, it is as close as I think anyone has ever come to writing a perfect crime novel. Here we have Wimsey, the outwardly gormless aristocrat, smitten with the prisoner, who is clever, striking rather than beautiful, and has a lovely voice, all of which is enough for him to fall head over heels. There's little opportunity for them to engage intellectually with one another, and a lot of plot to work through. But I think it's key to their future relationship that both of them have known what it is to face death. Both of them carry the damage of that experience into Have His Carcass, published in 1932, and both value the knowledge they have bought at such a terrible cost. Through her trial, Harriet loses her reputation, but gains the notoriety that allows her to be a successful author, so that by the time we find her in Oxford for her Gaudy in 1935, she has fame and some degree of fortune. Like Wimsey, she has to deflect both praise and intrusive inquiries from well-meaning strangers. I don't think this shared experience is an accident. Slowly, Sayers has engineered a situation where the inequalities between the two characters are levelled out, not least by bringing them to Oxford, where wealth and class are relatively unimportant. It's the work that matters in Oxford, and the mind that is capable of orderly thought, not a past filled with notoriety, or indeed opera singers. Whodunnit is a very unusual crime novel, especially in terms of series fiction. No murder is committed. Long tracts of the novel deal with issues such as the tyranny of domestic life for women and the importance of intellectual objectivity. Wimsey dips in and out, but doesn't properly play a part until 2/3 of the way through, which I think my editor would have queried, but it works brilliantly. He is present despite his absence, and the time without him leaves the field clear for Harriet to recover her bearings. Oxford belongs to the era before she met her unhappy lover, Philip Boys, before his death and her trial for his murder. As Sayers puts it, the stark shadow of the gallows had fallen between her and that sun-drenched quadrangle of grey and green. She comes back defiant and braced for censure, but finds only kindness and encouragement, and even praise for her crime novels. She has earned her degree and thus her place as an old student. And although she finds herself embroiled in a poison pen plot, Harriet is at home in the serenity of Oxford, happy and fulfilled, confident enough to embark on some research of her own on Sheridan Le Fanu that is for her personal intellectual satisfaction rather than for money. The fact that one had loved and sinned and suffered and escaped death was of far less ultimate moment than a single footnote in a dim academic journal establishing the priority of a manuscript or restoring a lost iota subscript. This is Harriet's thought, but it might as well be Peter's. Unusually for Sayers, who never otherwise seemed to feel the need to spell things out for readers, in 1935 she created a biographical note on Peter to fill in some of the blanks in his past. Eton is disposed of as the place where he was bullied for his unconventional character, but where he discovered a gift for cricket. Paris is where he discovered a gift for women and the finer things in life, guided by his uncle Paul. Balliol, however, is where he acquired his exaggerated Oxford manner and a monocle, fell in love for the first time, and took a brilliant first. Then, like a sword flashing down, the Great War takes away his hedonistic pursuits and his fiancée in one fell swoop, leaving him closed off from everyone behind the shield of impenetrable frivolity of manner. He is without purpose and function until he discovers his talent for detection. Oxford, therefore, is a prelapsarian world for Wimsey as much as it is for Harriet. His nephew, St. George, appears in the book as a kind of echo of the flippant, charming, and reckless Wimsey who was lost on the battlefield. Yet, as Sayers says, no one can bathe in the same river twice, not even the Isis. Harriet and Peter are not the same as their undergraduate selves, but they are far richer and more interesting for all that they have endured. It's a shock for Harriet when Peter appears in his MA gown at the side of the Master of Balliol, as if he had a perfect right to be in Oxford. It's an aspect of his character that she has never considered, and without it, she can't possibly understand him. I never thought of him as a historian. Well, he took her first anyway, didn't you know? She had not known. She had not even troubled to wonder. She had never consciously connected Wimsey and Oxford in her mind. At Oxford for the first time, they meet as equals. As Harriet realizes, a little too late, intellectual rigor demands honesty, and an honest appraisal of her feelings reveals a truth that she had literally run away from. With all of the other distractions of life at bay, she must confront her fears and her work head on. And Wimsey is not inclined to let her off in a personal or a professional context. And she quails at the idea of delving deeper into her characters and making them really live, because it would hurt her to make her work real. He dismisses her. What would that matter if it made a good book? Whodunnit is that book, where Wimsey for the first time loses all of his affectations and speaks with simple, straightforward honesty. He and Harriet are never more human than when they are moving together towards an understanding of what it means to be equal in a relationship and true to oneself. Whodunnit is a love story, but not just a romantic one. It's a love letter from Spires to Oxford itself, rather than Lord Peter Wimsey. No matter how glorious he is at punting, how musically he listens to the Bach concerto for 2 violins at the Balliol concert, no matter how well he behaves at high table, nor how apposite his quotations of minor Elizabeth poets may be in the Botanic Gardens. The last word must belong to Spires herself. It's hard to imagine a more lovely or memorable description of that beautiful city than the glorious celebration Spires gives us near the end of the novel, as Harriet and Peter look over the parapet of the Radcliffe camera. There, eastward, within a stone's throw, stood the twin towers of All Souls, fantastic, unreal as a house of cards, clear cut in the sunshine, the drenched oval in the quad beneath, brilliant as an emerald in the bezel of a ring. Behind them, black and grey, New College frowning like a fortress, with dark wings wheeling about her belfry louvers, and Queen's with her dome of green copper. And as the eye turns southward, Magdalen, yellow and slender, the tall lily of towers, the schools, and the battlemented front of University. Merton, square pinnacled, half hidden behind the shadowed north side and mounting spire of St. Mary's. Westward again, Christchurch, vast between Cathedral Spire and Tom Tower. Brasenose, close at hand, St. Aldate's and Carfax beyond, spire and tower and quadrangle, all Oxford springing underfoot in living leaf and enduring stone, ringed far off by her bulwark of blue hills.
Thank you, Jane. I was going to say not a dry eye in the house at the end of that description of Oxford. That's fantastic. And it's really interesting what you say about a love letter to Oxford as much as being a love affair between the two of them. That's really interesting. I am now going to introduce Carolyn Kirby, who is going to talk about Oxford Gothic. She studied history at St Hilda's. I was going to say here at St Hilda's because we are metaphorically here. And she's the author of 2 novels, both published by the independent crime fiction publisher No Exit Press. Her debut was The Conviction of Cora Burns, and it was nominated for awards by the Historical Writers Association and the Crime Fest Specsavers Crime Fiction Prize. And her recent novel, When We Fall, was named as one of the top 10 historical novels of 2020 by the Times and the Sunday Times. Over to you, Carolyn.
Thank you. So when my Victorian set debut novel, The Conviction of Cora Burns, came out, I was a bit surprised to hear it described as Gothic. But then I realised that when it came to novels, I didn't really know what Gothic meant. So I suppose I'd always lazily equated the term with supernatural or spooky, but it didn't take much research to realise that there's a lot more to the definition than that. And when thinking about the defining traits of Gothic classics of the last 250 years, there are good reasons why so many Oxford novels fall into this category. So by telling you about the Gothic elements of my 3 favourite Oxford novels, I want to explore what makes a novel Gothic and what it is about Oxford that brings out the dark side in authors. The starting point for the definition, I suppose, is Gothic architecture. And of course, the medieval cloisters and gargoyles of Oxford bring a menacing atmosphere to many of the books that are under discussion this weekend. I'm thinking particularly of Magpie Lane and the Oxford Brotherhood. But my first Oxford novel is, on the face of it, a witty campus novel. It's All Souls by Javier Marias. And it's only as the story progresses through the tribulations of a visiting Spanish academic, he's looking for love, or at least a one-night stand, in the seediest spots of late 20th century Oxford. Then we begin to notice the spirits of the departed are lurking on every staircase and bookshelf. For it's not only Oxford's tourist-friendly Potteresque quads that can exude a disquieting atmosphere of ghostliness. If you've never thought of Didcot railway station as particularly eerie, just read Marias's description of the platforms at midnight and the sudden metallic crunch of a beer can being thrown into a bin. In Oxford, physical spaces slip with disconcerting speed from the sublime to the banal, and the boundaries between the past and the present are similarly loose. At the Taylorian Institute, the octogenarian porter spends each morning in a different year of his own life with his dead wife. And amid the dull trisyllabic suburbs, as Marias calls them, think about it, and the bad Oxford nightclubs that I remember so well, the souls of the departed are rife. As if to demonstrate this, the printed text of the novel is suddenly interrupted by a photograph. This is John Galsworth. He's a real person, and you can see him first in rakish life and then his rather macabre death mask. Galsworth plays a key part in the fictional story of the novel, but his actual life was a real collation of bizarre events. And I would highly recommend you to do a Google search of John Galsworth, which will throw up and uncover Galsworth's very surreal literary connections, both with the Edwardian horror writer Arthur Machen and with Javier Marias himself. In Marias's Oxford, even living characters seem spectral against the ancient book-filled world of the scholarly city, which in his words is a dark, stuffy, dusty place, lit even on the brightest hours of the day by a couple of lamps with glass shades. This timeless academic Oxford is one that we all pass through only briefly, and it hovers largely unseen but ever present between the shopping centres, bus lanes and car parks of the modern city, just as the past hovers around Marias's present and the living are surrounded by the dead. By contrast, my next Oxford novel that demonstrates the Gothic is rooted entirely in the real world, or rather in the horrors that proceed from the human mind and from the abuse of obscene power. This book, After Such Kindness, by St Hilda's alumna and Booker Prize nominee Gaynor Arnold, is in fact my favourite Oxford novel. It's one of my favourite novels, full stop. I think Gaynor disputes my description of After Such Kindness as Gothic, but I think a key defining trait of certain Gothic novels concerns the misuse of power, especially perverse sexual power of the strong over the vulnerable, and in particular the male over the female. In Gaynor's novel, there are nothing supernatural, but the Gothic themes of nightmare and madness push at the boundary between the ordinary world and the terrors that lurk inside us. Here, collegiate Oxford heightens the foreboding that surrounds 11-year-old Daisy Baxter, the daughter of a popular Oxford clergyman, as she becomes entangled with John Jameson, a socially awkward yet whimsically minded Oxford mathematician. Their story is, of course, a dark fictional riff on the relationship between Lewis Carroll and Alice Liddell. And echoes of Lewis Carroll's writing echo through the text, as well as his odd otherworldliness and his interest in photography, which, like Lewis Carroll, he used to indulge his intense, and perhaps exploitative interest in children. Daisy is posed by the Reverend Jameson in even fewer clothes than you see here on the real Alice in Wonderland. In the story, ancient Oxford's cloisters and quads sow menace around the peculiar Don's intentions towards Daisy. As she climbs the twisting stone staircase to John Jameson's rooms and his heavy cracked door creaks open, we are willing the little girl to turn around and run away, although, as in all the best Gothic tales, she doesn't. In this story, though, the real horrors are hidden beneath a veneer of the everyday. The plush modern vicarage where Daisy lives is built, as the novel says, in an entirely Gothic style. But its colourful encaustic tiles, its velvet drapes and lush ferns hide the turbulence of dysfunctional family life within, just as Daisy's handsome, successful father conceals his inner turmoil of doubts and desires and insanity. Later, John Jameson's best-selling children's book is called Daisy's Dream, but its success comes, ironically, as Daisy's own world disintegrates into nightmare. This is a nightmare in the literal sense, originating from the Oxford English Dictionary's derivative of the word as a male demon believed to have sexual intercourse with a sleeping woman. Daisy's trauma pushes her to the limits of sanity, with severe amnesia and even, in true Gothic fashion, an episode of apparent transmogrification. Yet although the cause of Daisy's overwhelming distress is horribly real, it's written off by the men around her as a consequence of questionable reading matter about fairies, demons, and monsters, which have corrupted her childish imagination. But as Gaynor Arnold makes clear in this gripping, compassionate novel, the real monster in the story is the tyranny of male power in Victorian society. But going back to my original conception of what makes a novel Gothic, is the presence of the supernatural enough on its own to push a novel onto the Gothic shelf? The complexity of a clear answer to this question is illustrated by my next Oxford Gothic choice, an instance of The Finger Post by Ian Pears. This novel is well known as a classic of historical fiction, and if you know it, as perhaps from last year's talk at St Hilda's Crime Fiction Weekend, you may not remember it as being particularly Gothic in any way. The story is set primarily in Oxford in the 1660s, and it's a murder mystery cloaked in a subtle exploration of politics, religion, and society in the 17th century. But as well as being an evocative recreation of Restoration Oxford, the story has a strong mystical thread. And the book opens a window onto the very dark recesses of the human imagination. Many Gothic classics are set at a time of historical crisis when accepted beliefs are being questioned, and it's no coincidence that Finger Post delves into the period at which the battle between science and the supernatural for the intellectual upper hand was at its fiercest. A belief in the supernatural coexisted with rationalism in the finest minds of the day, as demonstrated by the Doctor, Richard Lower, one of the many fictionalized historical characters in the novel, when he describes seeing a ghost in his rooms at Christchurch. And the effort at an investigation into the central murder of New College fellow Robert Grove fuses an attempt at the forensic with what the reader recognizes as fake science. But the real mystery of Finger Post is not who killed Robert Grove in New College, but rather what place does the supernatural hold in the physical world? Like a belief in ghosts, a belief in the reality of religious agency in everyday life was a commonplace in the 17th century. But despite their religious faith, the characters still hesitate to believe in physical resurrection, in the sense, as the novel says, of being taken up bodily into the heavens in full sunlight and without any sound. Is this what really happens in the novel? Or are the supernatural events products of human imaginations in the grip of either a religious trance or an episode of psychosis? There is a strong tradition in Gothic fiction for apparently supernatural phenomena to be ultimately explained away as rational occurrences. This has been described as the Scooby-Doo school of Gothic fiction, where the ghostly apparition is always unmasked in the end as a bedsheet-wearing janitor. And of course, this is what often distinguishes Gothic literature from a straightforward ghost story. But in Fingerpost, the reader is left with a sense of ambiguity about the supernatural. The novel pushes at the boundaries of human consciousness and the laws of nature. In a historical moment when the membrane between the physical and the spirit world seemed fluid to some of the characters in the book, at least. But each of those characters is viewing their world through the blinkers of their individual superstitions or their religious fervour or political prejudices. And this is how, in this remarkable novel, Pears highlights the way in which all humans, ourselves included, are blinkered to the full reality of our existence by the beliefs and prejudices of our age. So you see, you don't have to believe in ghosts to enjoy Gothic fiction, especially fiction set in Oxford, as I'd heartily recommend you to discover by reading these 3 excellent Oxford novels.
Thank you, Carolyn. That was fantastic. Gosh, everyone's going to go away and read those books. And actually, I'm going to go away and read all of Dorothy L. Sayers all over again as well. There will be questions coming in, I hope, from our lovely audience. Before I start with any of those, I'm really interested in the connection between both your talks about power, about particularly, as you said, male over female power, and what you said, Jane, about Oxford College's degrees not really counting as a degree until really very, very recently. And I'm just interested in whether that's still true in what we're writing now as women writers. Do you feel, I mean, Carolyn, you're writing historical fiction anyway, do you feel that that power imbalance with your male and female characters is still sort of a rich seam in some way?
It is. I think it's central to everything I write, really. I don't know if it was because I was at St Hilda's when it was a women-only college, or because I was there in the 80s when, you know, talks, you know, the debate about gender was really starting to come to the fore in academia. But, you know, that was my real passion in my historical studies, was women's history. And I don't know, it's just sort of flows, you know, all the time really through everything I'm writing as fiction as well. And the debate is constantly evolving, isn't it, about gender, but it's always there. So it's constantly interesting.
Jane, what about your own work? Oh, Jane, you're muted. Can you unmute yourself?
I'm back. I think I'm very wary of sort of claiming any big themes in my work, but I think if there was one thing that runs through all of my books, it's how difficult it is for women to do the same job as men. So the compromises that they have to make and the slightly different set of difficulties that they might encounter just through doing their work. So whether they are police officers or barristers, as in the case of Ingrid in The Killing Kind, which is the most recent one, it's just a very different world that they inhabit. And I think it's one that's invisible if you're not in it. I think for a lot of men, they don't realize how many calculations women go through in their everyday life, sort of thinking, do I feel safe here? Should I go there? Will I be judged if I do this? You know, it's just a very different world for women. And I think that holds true now. Certainly held true for Dorothy L. Sayers. And I think I called it envy in my talk, that she just, you can see her thinking, this man can get away with anything because he's a wealthy man. And she can't get away with anything. So yeah, I think it is something that comes through in the work.
There are questions. Oh, everybody loves Gaudy Night. There are questions. Somebody wants to know, Jane, if there was a TV adaptation of Gaudy Night, who would you cast in the main roles? And also, what do you think about Busman's honeymoon and their relationship, given that Gaudy Night isn't the end of their story? Sorry, I'm doing two questions at you at once.
That's all right. Well, first, as long as I don't forget the second one. First things first, I've been going on for years now about how Tom Hiddleston would be the perfect Wimsey. The only problem with him is that he's a little bit too tall. But other than that, he would be absolutely wonderful. He went to Cambridge. He has a double first in classics. He can do cartwheels. Like, he does the whole, you know, the entire gamut of the Peter Wimsey experience. I really think he would be amazing. It's very hard to think of a Harriet Vane that would be better than Harriet Walter, because I think she was really the most superb Harriet Vane. But I did see Indira Varma in Present Laughter at the Old Vic, and she was absolutely wonderful. And I thought she would make a very good Harriet at the moment. So that was one thing. I deliberately didn't talk about Busman's honeymoon because, to me, it's such a huge book. I think you could certainly talk for an hour about it and what an incredible thing it is, and how she moves the characters on to sort of their own world. It really is an extraordinary book. So, I mean, I love it, and I could reread it many, many times, but I think it sort of draws together a lot of the threads that are in the other books and brings them all to a beautiful conclusion.
Now I have a question for Carolyn. It's from Pauline Burton, and she wants to know what you think of Jane Austen's mocking assessment of the Gothic in Northanger Abbey. And she says, has Gothic fiction developed since Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey?
It's constantly evolving, isn't it? I suppose Northanger Abbey is a real the best example of the Scooby-Doo school of Gothic fiction, isn't it? Because there's all of the sort of spookiness built up to be constantly revealed as something very banal. But of course, you know, things got darker. I suppose that that's idea of the moment of historical crisis, the 1790s, wasn't it? Was a bit like the 1650s, 1660s period of a lot of change happening in a short period of time, and that really does seem to impact on writers and unleash these kind of supernatural demons that are haunting inside their minds. Yes, after Northanger Abbey, there was, or around that time, there was a big explosion of Gothic fiction, wasn't there, with Mary Shelley and all of the classics that we know now. And I suppose they sort of always reflect a little bit their own age, don't they? You can't really imagine Dracula being written in anything other than the Victorian period. So yeah, definitely there's a kind of a Gothic fiction classic for each age, isn't there? And they are constantly evolving. And I think, you know, Gaynor's work that I talked about really focuses on kind of mental health as an aspect of the Gothic in literature, and you know, that's definitely the Gothic angle for our times.
I know if you go to, there's a church up at Whitby, not the old ruined abbey, but the actual parish church, and there's a little rather cross note on the gate, and it says, "Dracula was not a real person. Please, could you stop looking for him here?" There's another question here for Jane. I'm going to read this out because it's from Hannah Hurst Dunton, and she says, "Gaudy Night," which is absolutely her favourite crime novel, is full of toxic femininity, she says, and it ends with a conventional engagement that could be seen as Wimsey's romantic victory over Harriet. And do you believe it has a feminist message despite this?
I mean, I think I really do. And I'm not just saying that because it's one of my favourite books too. I think Sayers goes to a lot of trouble to make it clear that they are going to be equal, and that there has to be a sort of a balance. Many of their conversations in the book are about how you balance one another's needs and one another's beliefs, and they talk about the possibility of them arguing their way to their graves because, you know, they're both so intelligent and so principled, and that they won't ever compromise. And I think in that sense, I think it's a very idealized relationship. I don't think it was one that was available for many people at the time. I think it would be really quite shocking in the 1930s. I mean, in one of the earlier books, we have Lady Mary giving up her entire wealth to be held in trust so that she doesn't have more money than her husband, Parker, the police officer, because that would be so unthinkable in a marriage, that the wife would have more money than the husband, that they couldn't possibly be happy in that circumstance, which reads very oddly to a modern reader. But I think she's reaching towards a new kind of feminism that can take place within the sphere of also having domestic happiness. That would be my reading of it. I think it's idealized, but it's certainly hopeful.
I have a question for both of you. I was very interested in what you said when people say, "Oh, well, Dorothy L was in love with Peter Wimsey," and you said you can't be in love with one of your characters because you control them. I think that's really interesting. I mean, as a writer, and I want to ask Carolyn this as well, that the moment you invent your characters, the moment they sort of come into being, I suppose my question is that element of control over them, how much do you actually have that, do you think? Your central detective, Jane, do your characters just sort of suddenly surprise you?
Well, I had this with, I write about Maeve Kerrigan, and her boss is Josh Derwent, who is this very strong character. And when I wrote them originally, he's not in the first book in the series at all. He comes in the second book, and he was only supposed to be in that second book, and then I was going to let him disappear into the ether. And he sort of came back and insisted on coming back, and he's become very important to readers, and, you know, to how the balance works in the books. And I kind of wouldn't want to be without him. And I don't think I consciously did that. I mean, I certainly didn't intend for the series to develop in that way. I've sort of gone along with it. But ultimately, when people say, you know, "Oh, I love him so much," or "I feel, you know, have all these feelings for him," I don't have those feelings. I sort of have to manage to get him out of his car and into, you know, the police station or whatever. Like, I'm always trying to make him behave on the page. And I think I just don't quite buy into that line about Sayers falling for Wimsey. I think it's, as I said, I just think it's much more complicated.
I think characters are surprising. I think, yeah, Sister Agnes, my nun, is currently, I mean, I don't know, I haven't actually aged her, but she must have got older because I have. But she didn't have a very happy childhood. And I'm finding in the one I'm working on now that issues of maternal abandonment, she's dealing with homeless teenagers, and she spends a lot of the novel, I'm hoping not too boringly, sort of reflecting on her own fact of never really having been mothered, and how that's kind of triggered by dealing with these people at the moment. Carolyn, what about you? Do your character?
Yes, I mean, obviously you have to be in control of the characters to some extent, but I think, I mean, what are the characters? They're figments of your imagination, aren't they? But the imagination is an extremely powerful thing, as a sort of my delving into the Gothic as sort of emphasized. And they do speak to me. It's obviously not them, it's me speaking to me, but it's some region of my subconscious that I didn't know was there. So it only happens when I'm actually writing it, and it's particularly with dialogue, but they will start saying things that I didn't know was going to happen. The plot will change in ways that I didn't know was going to happen. Sometimes a whole hidden subplot is revealed to me underneath what I thought was going on. And it's obviously all from me, isn't it? But it's just the mind working in a conscious and an unconscious level, and the imagination is kind of the bridge really between the two.
It's really interesting when that happens, isn't it? Where
Yeah.
someone says something and you think, oh, I didn't know you were going to say that. Oh, that's quite. And also I think it's nice when you have a detective who's asking another character those questions, because then Sister Agnes also just thinks, oh, why did you say that? It's kind of, I think it's like acting, which I was going to say I can't do, although I did give my lady Erica, as people will know. There's a question here from Gaynor Cools. She wants to know, she says, could you live in a house where you'd found a murdered body? This is one for Gothic people like you.
Where I'd found one.
That seems,
well, yes. Or perhaps where you knew that someone had died. I think anybody that lives in an old house, you know, people have died in those houses, and it's not a problem, is it? Yes, I can't even begin to imagine finding you know, a corpse in the house. Don't know, perhaps it depends how much you like the house.
Jane, what do you think?
I think it depends on how much you like the person who was found dead. That might affect my opinion. I mean, I think, you know, I like old houses, I like old buildings, I like old furniture, and you sometimes think to yourself, well, this has witnessed a lot, and we don't know what its background is, and you know, we just sort of plow on. I'm neither a believer in the supernatural or not a believer in it, so I think I would probably live, but kind of keep an eye out for things hopping off shelves and rattling windows and unexpected phenomena.
We nearly have to come to an. I'm going to ask you each one more question, which is, what are you working on at the moment? I mean, I know you're working on Maeve Carrigan. What's happening with her now?
So she is, this is the 10th in the Maeve Carrigan series, and I think slightly influenced by lockdown, I've taken them out of their usual environment. So Maeve and Derwent are going undercover. It is a very fun thing to write.
And Carolyn, what are you working on?
I'm working on a novel set in the mid-18th century in the north of England and Scotland, and those issues we were talking about gender are really you know, at the heart of the themes of the book. And what can I say? The 18th century's perhaps most famous cross-dresser, Bonnie Prince Charlie, makes a very fleeting appearance.
Thank you. Thank you both very much. That was a fantastic session. Thank you to Jane Casey and Carolyn Kirby. And I think now I'm going to hand over to Triona, who is going to take us into the next part of this fantastic weekend.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you so much for that. As I've got so many things to read and reread now since this weekend. It's wonderful, and I must recommend Carolyn's work. It's lovely to have so many crime writers associated with St. Hilda's. It's such a shame to be bringing this weekend to an end, but of course we have a very important announcement, because I understand there has been something of a breakthrough in the case of the Cambridge corpse. I'm hoping that Chief Inspector Taylor is going to join us. Sir.
Good morning, all. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Well, first, thank you, all of you, for your valuable assistance. As you know, there's a prize for the first person to help us solve this complex and most intriguing case. Blackwell's Rare Books has kindly donated a splendid first edition of Gownsman's Gallows, written by the Oxford author Catherine Farrar, and published in 1952. Well, the police computer has now processed all of your responses and produced the answers we needed. The Thames Valley Cold Case Unit had a helicopter standing by, and as soon as the solution reached us, we flew directly to the last known address of the murderer and conducted a thorough search. I'm delighted to tell you that our sniffer dog, Hercule, led us to a sliding panel in the library. Behind it, the murderer had concealed a tin box containing this filmed confession. And that murderer is Margarita de Mello.
Tomorrow, I leave England on another secret mission to occupied France. It is probable that I shall not return, so I've decided to film my confession, if only so the others won't live out the rest of their lives under the suspicion of murder. Yes, I killed Wilfred Gormley, and yes, he richly deserved to die. He was blackmailing me, so I had to shut his mouth one way or another. You see, Erica Hallard and I were desperately in love. We had no choice. It was a perfect coup de foudre for both of us. Her engagement to Klaus von Kane was perfect cover. She never meant to marry him. She sent me the well of loneliness as a love token. Yes, she was my Bunnykins, and I was her Twinkerbell. Wilfred came to a cocktail party at my house a few weeks before. That was when I gave him the push, and that was when he stole the book from my bedroom. Erica knew nothing about the blackmail. In his view, she wasn't worth blackmailing. She had only the allowance her father gave her. I met Gormley in Kensington Gardens and tried to scare him off with threats of the police, but he was implacable. He wanted £10,000 for the book. Otherwise, he would sell the story to every newspaper in London with the book and its inscription as proof. Darling Erica, her handwriting was very distinctive in the way that the handwriting of a true poet often is. So, I lured Wilfred down to Oxford. I said I'd bring the money out to him if he concealed himself in a punt under the willow in the meadow on the Saturday evening. I knew the boat race story, so I got my mother's maid to buy a Cambridge Boat Club tie, just to confuse the investigation. She paid cash, so it couldn't possibly be traced back to me. After dinner that night, I took a carving knife and went outside. It was easy enough to stab Wilfred. Greed had made him gullible. But to my horror, I couldn't find the novel. He was a dead weight. Like so many former rowing men, he'd run to fat. Well, I'm just a slip of a girl. Anyway, I tried to search him, but I couldn't turn him over properly. I couldn't even be sure he brought the novel with him. He might have meant to double-cross me. I had to go back inside. I was in a perfect funk when the police asked me about the book. So Wilfred must have brought it with him after all. I tried to distract the police, and an hour later we learned that all the evidence had fallen in the river. So there was nothing for Erica and I to worry about after all. Do I regret killing Wilfred Gormley? No. He deserved to die. Darling Erica's dead now, too. A direct hit in the Blitz while she was driving an ambulance. If anyone watches this confession, I shall be dead as well. Look up in the night sky, stranger. Somewhere above you, a bright star called Twinkerbell burns for her Bunnykins.
Back to you, Inspector.
Now, the murderer, Margarita de Mello, was a person of great intelligence, and she tried to divert our attention away in several directions. But she made one mistake. As Mr. Bright emphasised, at the time of the interviews, only the victim's identity and the fact that he had been murdered in a punt on the river were public knowledge. Now, you will have noticed that several witnesses mentioned that the murder punt was under a willow. Since the witnesses all knew the meadow, no doubt they assumed the punt was there because otherwise both the punt and the corpse would have been noticed much earlier during the long summer evening. But no one except the police and the murderer could have known that Wilfrid Gormley had the well of loneliness in his pocket. Several of you cleverly deduced that a lesbian love affair was at the heart of this murky business. And one of you came up with the brilliant theory that Klaus von Kane was in fact a secret transvestite. Sadly, that was wrong. Several of you got almost everything more or less right, including Josephine Tay as the source of the characters' names. Everything, that is, except the correct murderer. So our winner is Rosie McGlynn, who was the only one correctly to identify Whodunnit, and who also picked up the Josephine Tay reference, though, Rosie, I must say you were tantalizingly vague about why or how. Still, well done, and the prize, Rosie, will soon be winging its way to you. Many thanks to all of you for your help, from all of us at Thames Valley Police.
Yes, thank you very much, Rosie, for rescuing the police yet again in another fiendishly difficult case. We really have come to the end now. As you see, a few familiar faces have joined us to say goodbye. I want to thank, of course, all our speakers who have put, as you can imagine, an awful lot of work into preparing. Into preparing for this weekend. I want to thank our chairs, particularly Alison and Jake, who have just motored this along so brilliantly and tied so many little strings together from one session to another. Alison and Jake are on the committee, which also comprises Mick Heron, Jean Harker, and Carolyn Kirby. So they will be putting in all the work and the admin to get this going. And last but definitely not least is Harris, who's lurking in the background here. Harris and I have been in the studio all weekend, and Harris has made it all happen. And I think special applause for the special effects on the Whodunnit this year. So I'm afraid that is it for this year. I hope that if we are all together again next year, it will be both in the ether and in real Oxford. Until then, it's goodbye from us.